Lois Lunowitz, and I am the coordinator for the Worcester Regional Medical Reserve Corps. And I have done a presentation here a few years ago. So out of curiosity, how many of you know who the Medical Reserve Corps is? Okay, a couple. One of my volunteers, actually.
I was at the presentation a couple years ago.
Okay, great. So for the rest of you, the Medical Reserve Corps is a volunteer organization made up of both medical and non-medical volunteers. We came into being following the attacks on 9/11, and we are the brainchild of the federal government. The reason that the Medical Reserve Corps was formed was because so many people showed up in New York and Washington wanting to assist. And the incident commanders had no way of verifying who these people were. Even if they had a license on them that said they were a nurse or a doctor, there was no way to validate that it was a true license or that it was currently valid. And so the government thought, wouldn't it be great if we had a volunteer organization where individuals would already be credentialed so that when they show up at an incident, we could look at their badge and we would have confidence that they are who they say they are. And so that's how the Medical Reserve Corps came into being. So we are federally recognized. In Massachusetts, we have approximately 40 units, and nationwide, we're probably about 1,000 units right now. Our volunteers come from the communities that we serve. Primarily, we are affiliated with boards of health. And in Massachusetts, our lead organization is actually the Massachusetts Department of Public Health. And so we work with them throughout the year, developing programs and ways to get the word out about the Medical Reserve Corps. We are not first responders, we are support. So if you've ever been to a flu clinic, you know that it takes many individuals to pull a flu clinic off. Many of those individuals are non-medical. You have greeters, you have people that help you with your paperwork, people that take photos of insurance cards. Sometimes they have a place at the end after you've received your shot so that you can sit down for a few minutes, make sure that you don't have a reaction to the shot. Those are typically all non-medical personnel. If a town had to open an emergency shelter because of an extended power outage or some other event, although we would probably have at least one or two medical people that were present, mostly it would be non-medical people who would be assisting the town operating that shelter. We also participate in fun things. So as an example, in June, the Worcester Regional Medical Reserve Corps pulled together some volunteers. We also included some area CERT personnel, I'll tell you about them in a second, and some local emergency management people. And we helped Ashby with their 250th parade, which was a pretty big deal. And we actually manned the recovery tent at the end of the parade route. Luckily, it wasn't a horribly hot, humid day, so mostly people just needed water. We didn't have any real health emergencies. But that was a fun thing to do, something a little bit different, not an emergency. So those are the kinds of events that we participate in. And I did bring some information with me if any of you are thinking about a volunteer activity. I have information on who we are and how to do that. So our other mission, aside from assisting communities, is emergency preparedness. We want to make sure that as many individuals as possible are prepared personally and as families in case of an emergency. And I have been coming to senior centers for a while, giving presentations on emergency preparedness. And usually I will always talk about having a plan. And I've discovered over time that talking to individuals about creating a plan is sort of like Bambi in the headlights, because it seems overwhelming. Where do I start? What do I put in my plan? How do I write a plan? And even though we have information that the state has put out that gives you some guidelines on how to prepare a plan, it's still a little overwhelming. When I heard about this program, Let's Make a Plan, and realized that I actually can hand each one of you a plan, I thought this is perfect. And we're going to go through this at the end of the presentation. I'm going to give you a little bit of emergency preparedness to start with. But this makes it so much easier. You just go from page to page, you collect what they tell you to collect, you check it off as you have it, or you write the information down that they ask for, and by the time you get to the end of the plan, you're all set to go. So I thought this is a really great way of introducing plans to individuals. And I know myself that it can be challenging to sit down and put all this together. So I'm going to start with my PowerPoint. Let's make a plan. How did we get here? And as I mentioned to some of you earlier, I borrowed this from the Franklin County of Government. They have an MRC unit there, and it was their coordinator who actually came across this, so I just borrowed it from him. And it was put together with help from the Disability Law Center and the Homeland Security Council. This actually started this program following Katrina, reports and court decisions, and I'm sure we all remember how devastating Katrina was. There were a lot of lessons learned as a result of that storm, and personal planning is certainly one of them that came out of that. So our goals today are to plan before, during, and after, to establish a personal network, to practice your plan, and to maintain and update your plan. And again, I know that sounds a little overwhelming, but as we get into it, you'll see that it's not too bad. So there are 3 steps to preparedness. So this is to get a kit, but you're not going to really get a kit. You're going to make a kit. And it's not as awful as it sounds. We're going to make a plan. That's what this is. And you're going to be informed. And I know that sounds kind of easy, but as I've been out and about, I usually go to health fairs and community events, and I set up my table, and I talk to people about preparedness. And I'm amazed to find out that many individuals are just not aware of what's going on around them. They don't listen to the television or the radio. They don't follow the weather. They have no clue. I'm sure you've all, if you do watch TV, you've seen reports following storms where individuals go, I didn't know it was coming. Well, they've been talking about it for 8 days now. How did you not know it was coming? That's part of being informed. So what is preparedness? Preparedness is actually about recovery. It's taking steps necessary so that you are able, when the event is over, to get back to your normal routine as quickly as you possibly can. Now, I usually do a little game, but this room is very sparse, and I don't know that we really have a lot in here to work with. But it's just to get you thinking. What do we have in this room right now that we could use in a disaster? The next question is, what do you have on you personally that you could use in a disaster? And the third question is, what in this room could be altered to be used in a way that it wasn't intended? And this is just to get you thinking, and I'm going to get into that a little bit further into the presentation. So I have people come up to me all the time and say, I don't need a plan. I'm going to be all set for whatever reason. I don't live in a low-lying area. I'm not going to get flooded. I have a generator. I'm not going to lose power. But there are lots of things that can happen that can affect individuals. And so having a basic plan is really a good idea. You're never going to be prepared for everything because we just have no way of predicting the future. And what can I do? I'm just one person. So this is a very elaborate scene that would probably never be created in real life. But which one of these farmers do you think is going to recover more quickly? The one on the right that built that huge retaining wall around his property to keep the water out. Most of us are not going to be able to go to that extreme. I know that even though I own my own home, I don't have a huge pantry or storage room, so I would never have the space for two large storage units. But that doesn't mean that we all can't have a few extra things that we can tap into if we need to in an emergency. So as I mentioned, we're going to develop a plan. And I haven't passed the plans out yet. You can put your names on them when you get them. So what is personal preparedness? It's knowing your limitations. It's knowing what you have to offer if you're going to help out a neighbor, a friend, or a relative. And more importantly, it's knowing what your personal needs are. And we're going to get into that a little bit. Be creative. One person's perceived disability is often a strength in another situation. I have people come, I talk about recruiting volunteers, and I'll have people come up to me and say, well, I'm not really very physical. I have a hard time getting around, and I probably wouldn't be a very good volunteer. But that doesn't mean that you couldn't sit at a table and hand out information. Doesn't mean that you couldn't get on the phone and talk to someone. So there's always something that somebody can do. And then just be aware and try to reduce the risk as much as you can ahead of time. This is what the front of the plan looks like. So this is a suggested, and this is in your plan, some of the things that you might want to put aside. And a lot of the things that they're showing here are things that you're going to use if you shelter in place. And all shelter in place means is that you're not leaving your house. So when we get those 2 to 3 day blizzards that unfortunately we know are coming, that's a shelter in place situation. So you want to make sure that you've got things like a battery powered radio or a weather radio in case the power goes out. First aid supplies, water, flashlights, batteries, a manual can opener. And they show the whistle, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. So emergency supplies are going to include non-perishable food, personal sanitation items that you may need. Medications is tricky because we're all on a very tight leash right now relative to how often we can refill our prescriptions. So having an extra supply of medication is probably not something that most of us are going to be able to do because we use every little bit of medication that we have. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't have a list of your medications, what they are, what your dosages are, and who the prescriber is. Cash and checks. If any of you, I don't know, was Northborough affected by the ice storm in 2008? So if you remember back, at least for the first couple days, the ATMs didn't work. There were massive power outages. Where I lived in Westminster, I didn't have power for 7 days. And so, as they were taking their time trying to weave through all the massive overlays of electrical wiring, it took a while to get some of those ATMs up and running. And I'm somebody who lives by ATMs. I very rarely have cash. But when a storm is coming, that's a really good time for you to just make a visit and get some cash and have it on you. And then entertainment. The reason they're talking about entertainment, and this could be in your home, or it could be if you have to evacuate and go to a shelter. I think a lot of us are used to having the television on, at least for background noise. And if we lose power, we're not going to have that. We may have our battery-powered radio that we might be able to listen to, but we probably want to conserve those batteries. So things just to, keep our mind off of what's going on. Books to read, crossword puzzles, cards, something just to help pass the time. And that would be equally important if you had to leave your home and go to an emergency shelter as well. Gather information, and these are things you're going to put in your Go kit. And a Go kit is somewhat similar to what we talked about earlier with supplies you're going to have at your home. But a go kit is something that you're going to put together and either put it in your car, put it in the closet by your front door, or someplace where you can grab it quickly, so that if you have to leave your house for any reason, everything's going to be in there and you're going to be somewhat self-sufficient with what you've put in your go kit. And so that includes things like insurance policies, and we're going to go over that more in the plan. Medical and durable equipment information. So, if individuals are on oxygen or have electric wheelchairs, these are things where you want to have that service information available so that if something happens, you can get in touch with the manufacturer or the distributor and get repairs or parts. Photographs with identification tags, and I'm going to show you a photo of that in a second. And then take photos of belongings in your home. So whether you live in an apartment or you live in a private home, I'm sure we all have some kind of insurance. And usually policies today are replacement policies, which means that if you can prove the value of what you have in your home, you will get, if not all, a good percentage of the value of that item. But you need to be able to prove to the insurance company what you lost. So if your insurance agent hasn't mentioned this to you, I'll mention it to you. What you should really be doing is go around your home or your apartment and take 2 to 3 photos of every room and concentrate on those things that are high-ticket items, like your bedroom set, your electronics, your dining room set if you've got one, antiques, which should also be insured, so that when you have a loss, you can go to your insurance company and you can show them a picture of your antique bedroom set or whatever to prove that this is really and truly what you're trying to replace. Know where your utility valves are and how to shut them off. And I'll also confess to you that I don't necessarily know where mine are and how to shut them off. I will tell you that in the ice storm of 2008, when we lost power, I really didn't know what to do about my furnace. I didn't know if I should shut it off or leave it on. And I even contacted the company that services my furnace and said, I don't know what to do. I mean, we had no way of knowing how long the power was going to be off. And I didn't know if I was going to be helping or hurting the situation by turning it off. And I ultimately ended up, they didn't have a really good answer for me either. So I ended up not turning the furnace off, which in the end probably turned out to be the correct decision. So although they want you to know how to do all these things, and just on a day-to-day basis, it's probably a good idea to know how to do these things, but you have to weigh each situation as it comes up. Copies of important papers. So we don't necessarily want you to take your driver's license and your social security card and your original will, but it might not be a bad idea over time. And one of the things I'm going to tell you as we go through the plan is I don't want anyone leaving here thinking, I have a homework assignment, I have to do this whole thing tonight, because you don't have to do this whole thing tonight. You can plan it out and do a little bit here and a little bit there. But having copies of all of these things, either in a safe place where you can get at them, and that doesn't mean in your home, or having them in your go kit, makes a lot of sense, because at some point in time you may need some of these things. And we're going to go over this again when we get to the actual plan. And when I talked about having a picture, this is what I'm talking about. Have someone take a photograph of you holding up your name and your date of birth. Things happen in emergencies. We don't like to think about them. We don't like to talk about them. But you may get injured and you may not remember who you are. Or, less dramatic, we all react differently under stressful situations. And I know that things that would normally be right on the tip of my tongue, if I'm in a high stress situation, I might not be able to retrieve it right away. And so I know it sounds really crazy that maybe something will happen and you won't remember your name or you won't remember your date of birth, but this is the reason that they tell you to take this kind of a photograph and keep it in your go bag. How many of you have cell phones? few of you. Oh, a lot of you. And there it is now. So I always thought that this, in case of emergency, was some kind of an app. And as I was going through the slides a few weeks ago, preparing for some of these presentations, I realized it's not an app. You just put this in your contact list. So if you haven't done this yet, that would be one thing I would recommend doing today as a start on your preparedness plan. In case of emergency is going to be the name of your contact page, and they recommend at least 3 contacts. So what I did, I put my son in as one with his cell phone. I put my mom in as one with her landline phone, and then I put my sister in as an other. And then at the bottom, under additional info and notes, I explained who went to what with a name, so that if something happens, most first responders know to take the cell phone, look for it in case of emergency, and then they know who to contact. So that would be something I would suggest doing sooner rather than later. How many of you have pets? Not a lot of you, a couple of you. So whatever you do for you, you want to do for your pets. I'm sure that, if we think back to some of the consequences of Katrina, there were a lot of people who lost their lives because they wouldn't leave their pets. And that's understandable. I think all of our pets are our babies, and we would never think of leaving them behind. And so following Katrina, the federal government actually came up with a policy, which has subsequently been adopted by the state of Massachusetts, which says, when you go, your pet goes. And most community shelters now, emergency shelters, have some kind of a plan, because they've been given a directive by MEMA to do so, have some kind of a plan to shelter you and your pet. Now, unless you have a service animal, and service animals right now are the only animals that are recognized as being able to be with you in the shelter, most situations you and your pet are going to be separated. You may be in the same building, you may be in different buildings on the same campus, or a worst case scenario, you may be at one end of town and your pet may be housed at the other end of town. But you want to be able to claim your pet when the incident is over. So I suggest doing a couple of things. Yes, take a photo of your pet, but more importantly, take a photo of your pet with you. Have someone come.
Sign-up sheet for people.
Okay. Have someone come and take a photo of you with your dog or your cat or your 2 dogs and your 3 cats, whatever the case may be, so that when that animal or those animals go into the shelter, they're going to put that photograph right on the cage or cages where your animals are kept, so that somebody can't come along and claim your pet accidentally or on purpose. Because they'll be able to look and say, well, you're not the person in the photograph, so this must not be your pet. So do both of those things. Make sure you have a cage or a carrier ready to put your pet in, or in the case of a dog, a leash of some kind, identification tags or microchips. I don't know how many of you saw the recent story on the news about the dog from Florida that ended up in Michigan and was reunited with his family because he had a microchip. So microchips can be lifesavers for your pets. Vet records and proof of ownership. So just like you want to have your medical records accessible, you want them for your pet as well. Some shelters will not take your pet if you're not current on rabies shots and things like that. So this is information you want to have with you. Obviously, food, water bowls. Shelters will do their best to have these things available for your pets, just like most emergency shelters will have some kind of a meal plan for you. But pets are sometimes fussy. They only like certain kinds of foods. And however stressful this is going to be for you, this is going to be stressful for your pet too, especially if you have a pet that has the run of your house and has maybe never been in a cage his or her whole life. And now all of a sudden they're in this little confined space. They may see you 2 or 3 times a day, maybe not. So you want to try to do as much as you can pre-planning so that your pet is going to be comfortable in its surroundings until the two of you can be reunited and go back home. That's why they talk about blankets, favorite toys, comfort objects, things like that. Now, in some shelters, if it's a co-shelter where you're in the same building or on the same campus, the ideal situation is that you're going to care for your own pet. So you're going to work out a schedule with whoever's running the animal part of the shelter, and you're going to come however many times, and you're going to walk your own dog. You may feed your own dog. In other situations, especially if you're separated and you're in one end of town and your pet's at another end of town, that's going to be done by someone else, someone that's manning the shelter. So you just want to try to pre-plan as much as you can. I love this because we've all seen, I'm sure, as the hurricanes were coming or as the blizzards are coming, there's always a story about how the supermarket shelves are bare and how, everybody, there's been a couple of really significant blizzards where the governor has declared that he wants everybody off the road unless you're emergency personnel at 1 o'clock in the afternoon. And at 12 o'clock in the afternoon, everyone's making a beeline for the grocery store, and then they're mad because there's nothing left. So don't be one of those people that goes to the grocery store just before the roads close down. Try to plan in advance. Practicing your personal preparedness plan. So I'm going to talk about this a little more as we actually go through the plan about laying out supplies and practice using equipment. It's advisable if you want to. It's always your choice. If you want to put some non-perishable items in your go kit, like protein bars, breakfast bars, boxes of raisins or things like that, so that many of us like to snack throughout the day. And if you have to go to an emergency shelter, you're probably not going to have that luxury. They're going to do breakfast, lunch, and dinner. They probably will have coffee and tea and water available for you all the time. But they're probably not going to have a lot of snack things for you to choose from. The same may be true. Maybe you're not going to go to an emergency shelter. Maybe you're going to go to your cousin's house in Maine or whatever, and they may have a different eating plan than you do. But it's important that if you're going to include things like that in your go kit, that they recommend about every 6 months or so, kind of with the change of the seasons, that you open up your kit, take out the things that have been sitting there for 6 months, and put new, fresh things in. And that would be the same for your pet supplies as well. Probably the easiest thing to do if you're preparing a kit for your pet is dry food, dog food, cat food, whatever, if they like it. But over time, that also can go bad. So just remember to rotate that out as well. So practicing your personal plan. They ask you, and in the plan, and we're going to go over this, where would you go if you had to get out of your house? And I'll be the first to confess that I didn't have a plan when the ice storm hit. And so after the 3rd day of no power, even though I had about 12 blankets on my bed, I was still frozen solid. I realized I couldn't stay there anymore. But I didn't want to leave my 2 cats in the house. And so I spent the better part of that Sunday afternoon calling around south of Worcester, trying to find a hotel that I could go and take my 2 cats. So in the middle of an emergency is not really the best time to be making that plan. So that's something we want you to think about in advance. And there's different scenarios to consider. Maybe you just need to get out of your neighborhood. So maybe you've got a friend or a relative on the other side of town or a couple towns over. What if you had to leave the area? I have a very dear friend who lives in Florida, and her sister moved down there about a year ago, and she was in the evacuation zone. She didn't really have a plan. She ended up driving to Virginia. I said, what was she doing in Virginia? She went from Florida to Virginia? And apparently, because the storm kept shifting, every time she'd get to another state, she'd listen to the report and they'd say, oh, well, it's coming in this direction. So she just kept driving. That's not a plan. Contact the folks you expect to stay with to make sure that the phone numbers, the addresses, the entry routes and roads haven't changed. And I have an interesting story to tell you about that. I have very dear friends that live in a remote area of Pennsylvania. I've been to their home many, many times. We've been friends since 1974. And about 3 years ago, I took a trip down there. And of course, I left early in the morning and with, stops here and there. I got there after dark. And I got to what I thought was their house. But it looked different. The house was not the way I remembered it. So I looked at the house and I thought, no, this must not be it. I must be, at the wrong house. So I kept driving up the road, another 3/4 of a mile. When I came to the next intersection, which I recognized, I thought, that had to be the house. So I turned around, I went back. By the time I got there, the lights were all on because they had seen this car up on the road, sitting there for a few minutes. You know why I didn't recognize their house? Because they used to have a front to back porch on the left side of their house facing the driveway. A big porch, like 8-10 feet wide and the whole length of the house. Well, guess what? They'd enclosed it and made it a living room. So when I drove up, my landmark, which was their porch, was gone. And there I was in the dark, and even though it looked familiar, I wasn't sure. And of course, it wasn't like they didn't know I was coming, but they said, we're so sorry. We never told you that we enclosed our porch and made a living room out of it. So those are the kinds of things you want to find out in advance. And the other thing they recommend is practicing your escape route both in the daytime and at night. And I will tell you that as I'm getting older, I am noticing that things look different at night than they do during the day. Yes. Roads that I've been familiar with my whole life. And sometimes I'll look up and for, an instant, I think I'm not really sure where I am. So try practicing under both circumstances. If you have medical needs or need specific help, you want to be able to quickly explain the best way to move you and your equipment. Practice being brief, clear, and specific, whether you do it verbally or if you feel like you need to just write it down and hand it to someone. First responders, especially in the wake of a major incident, are going to have many, many stops that they need to make. And it isn't that they're not caring, but time is of the essence. So they don't need to know what happened the day before, that you didn't sleep well, that breakfast didn't go well, that you weren't sure what you were going to have for lunch, that you hadn't heard from your neighbor. All they want to know is, why am I here and what do I need to do to assist you right now in this instant? And so if you're someone who has the gift of gab and likes to, embellish things, try coming up with a speech and try it out on your friend or your relative and have them tell you if you need to chop it down a little bit. So what does being informed mean? Learning the types of disasters or emergencies that may likely occur. And that's kind of tongue-in-cheek because I can tell you that when the tornadoes hit in Western Mass in 2011, probably nobody in any of those towns would have told you that they thought they would ever be hit by a tornado. And that holds true for the people in Revere that had a tornado a couple of years ago. So even though it talks about things that may occur, try to do that with a broad brushstroke. These events can range from affecting only you and your family to those affecting your entire community, like the ice storm, which affected multiple communities. Know the difference between different weather alerts, such as watches and warnings, and what actions to take. And that assumes that at some point in time you're doing what I talked about earlier, which is catching an occasional weather report. So watches and warnings. In a watch, it means that conditions are favorable, but not necessarily that something is imminent. And so that could be true of a tornado. It could be true of severe thunderstorms. I actually remember the day that the tornadoes hit in Western Mass. I wasn't in Western Mass, but I could tell that something was off. The sky was a little bit different. The air was a little bit different. I knew something was up. I didn't know it was going to result in a tornado, but I could tell that something was off. And that's part of being aware. That's part of being prepared. A warning means that it's imminent. And the tornado, we're not an area that gets a lot of tornadoes. So your town may or may not have some type of early warning system where they can turn on the siren or something like that. Severe thunderstorms, again, you know, we've all lived through many severe thunderstorms. We can kind of tell how things are evolving, and sometimes, you know, it happens really quickly, but it isn't that we don't know it's coming as a rule. Learn about emergency alerts. Learning about receiving alerts and local emergency plans for shelter and evacuation. So I know I asked this question when I was here last time, but how many of you know where your town emergency shelter is? There will be information that will come out, you know, at the time. But again, there's a whole issue of, are you going to have power? Are you going to have a radio that you can receive the message? Local emergency contacts and local advance. I'm guessing that Northborough has something like Code Red or some other alert system that comes in. You can have it come to your cell phone. You can have it come to your landline phone. How many people in this room have signed up for that? So again, not everybody. So that would be something that could help you here at the Senior Center. And I strongly suggest that you sign up for that if you're not already. You can receive important life-saving alerts no matter where you are. Public safety officials use reliable systems to alert you. And many communities also offer emergency alerts. And that would be typically through their Code Red. What are wireless emergency alerts? I know I've gotten them on my phone. They have nothing to do with the town. You're not charged for them on your cell phone plan. These are alerts that come through other means. And you know that they're coming. They either appear as a text message or they have a very loud tone. That was an emergency alert? Okay. And so it'll tell you the time and the type of alert, what you should do, and the agency issuing the alert. And the message will usually be very short, about 90 characters. But again, they include a special tone and a vibration, and they're usually repeated twice. So just try to be aware of that. And then follow any action that's advised by the message or by your local authorities. And your phone will pick up this alert even if you're out of your area. So if you travel into an area where an alert has been sent, your phone will still pick up that message and relay it to you. This is not the same service that public service agencies will provide for you. It's something different, but they work in tandem with each other, and you won't be charged for anything. If for some reason the networks are jammed or there's an issue with the cell towers not picking things up, will you still be able to receive this wireless message? And the answer is yes, that you would be able to. And if you don't have a cell phone or that type of a device, that's why we talked about having the NOAA weather radio. make sure that you have some device where you can be aware of what's going on around you. Outdoor sirens we talked about, and other alerting messages. I can't stress enough the importance of doing what your public safety officials tell you to do. I've worked in public service a good portion of my career, and I know that these decisions are not reached lightly. It's a very, I don't even know how to say this. For a public official to tell you to leave your home, this is something that requires a team of people to discuss the pros and the cons. And they understand what the effects are of asking someone to do that. So if they have reached that decision and they tell you to please evacuate, they're serious and they want you to evacuate. If you think back to when Irma was heading for Florida and they were trying to evacuate the Keys, they came several times and said, you're going to get hit by this storm, there's going to be storm surge, there's going to be flooding, you're in a low-lying area, and oh, by the way, at a certain point of time, we're not going to be sending our first responders out. So we beg you, please leave your home. But if you choose not to, do us all a favor and write your name on your arm so that when we have to recover you, we'll know who you are. I'll tell you, if I was one of those people trying to decide if I should go or stay, and somebody said that to me, I would go, because that's pretty drastic. So listen to your public safety officials. They have your best interest at heart, and they're not going to tell you to do something unless they feel really strongly that that's the best course of action. Again, prepare your pets and turn off your utilities. Financial first aid, grab your Go kit, and this talks about a financial first aid kit. I'm not really sure what's involved with that. That's not one of my areas of expertise, but I think it probably talks about having funds accessible, maybe different ways of doing it, and then things that we talked about, having cash and checks available. Drive safely. I'm sure we've all seen the stories that are done and the roads are packed. Nobody's going anywhere. People do crazy things. They drive onto the median, they pass on the wrong side of the road. They can cause accidents. Even if they don't get in an accident, they can cause one. And a lot of the reason that people are driving crazy and not being mindful of basic safety in driving is because they waited too long. The storm is imminent and they need to get out of there and nobody's going anywhere. So that's another reason to plan and leave. Give yourself enough time because the roads are going to be very busy. The importance of a personal support network, and that's additional information you're going to put in your plan. Create a network made of individuals who will check on you in case of an emergency. And it can be your friends, your roommates, family members, relatives, people that you think are going to best work for your situation. Ideally, remember earlier I talked about ICE in the phone, and they recommend 3 contacts. It could be the same 3 contacts that you put in your emergency plan. It could be 3 different contacts. That's up to you. And it should be not just in your home, but if you're a regular at the senior center or a place where you typically volunteer, where people are used to seeing you, it's a good idea just to let them know so that if you don't show up one day and nobody is aware that you're on vacation, they'll know to check on you. And that's not just for emergencies, that's for every day that somebody will know. So many times we've heard on the news that the police were called to do a well check call on the house. And that's because the person didn't show up at work, or they didn't meet their friend for lunch, or some plan that they had made they didn't show up for. And so make sure that you have a network. And then 7 important items to discuss and implement. Again, make arrangements for your support network to check on you. Exchange important keys. How many of you have given your apartment or your house key to a relative or a friend so that if they have to find you? Well, that's good. A majority of you have. The last thing you want to have to deal with is having to fix your door because they had to break it down to get to you. So giving a key to someone is a pretty simple thing. And then show individuals where you keep emergency supplies so that if something happens and you are sheltering in place and they call you and you don't pick up the phone and they go to your house once they're in, they should know where to find things like first aid kits or your medications or things like that so they can help you. Share copies of your relevant emergency documents, and we'll talk about that when we go through the plan. Agree on and practice methods for contacting each other. It's great that you've given your keys out to people, have people giving you keys for their places, and that might be something to talk about as well. Agree on and practice methods for contacting each other. Don't count on the phones working. How many of you have landlines at your homes? Most of you. And that's good because they do recommend that even if you are mostly dependent on a cell phone, that you have a landline or even the cordless phones. Once that power goes off, there's only so much stored in the battery, whereas usually, and not always, the landline will continue to work. I know for me, when I finally got back to my house after the ice storm, my landline, which had been fine, stopped working. And I live in a place where my cell phone doesn't work. So if I have a landline that doesn't work, I have no communication at all. So they're pretty reliable, but things happen to landlines too. And we talked about the relationship being mutual. Prepare for power outages. We've all gone through our share of power outages. We're pretty used to them. They're not always, 7-10 days long, thank goodness, but we've certainly been through enough. How many of you have carbon monoxide and smoke alarms in your homes? And that's a good thing. You actually, if you have electric heat, you actually don't need a carbon monoxide detector, but it doesn't hurt to have it. And it's important to check the batteries. We're going to be turning the clocks in a couple of weeks, and that's usually when they recommend when you turn your clock, you check your batteries. And that's a good time to just check your alarms and make sure that they still work, even if the battery is good. Just press that test button and make sure that it works. And if you have a combo unit, it's usually 2 different buttons. One will test the smoke detector, and the other button will test your carbon monoxide detector. And we talked about evacuating or sheltering in place. Do whatever your public safety officials tell you to do. Practice your plans day and night. They talk about drills in the community. I've been doing emergency preparedness for many years now. There aren't a lot of drills that are open to the community. I recently read about an MBTA drill that happened in Air, and they talked about involving public safety officials. But I don't know if they opened it up to the general population to be victims. If they do, and it's something that you hear about and you're interested in, it would be a great exercise for you to go through. But I think they're pretty few and far between. And then review and update your plan regularly, and we'll go through that when we go through the plan.